Thank you for braving our latest quarantine situation. I'm happy to see everybody, and yes, we don't all just come for the free coffee and pastries, although they're good. Jerry, as you probably all know, has a very deep and wide knowledge of Los Alamos. Or say it again if we want. Jerry, as you all know, is very knowledgeable about Los Alamos, having been a research director there for how many years? Many. Many.
About 30.
About 30. Okay. That's good enough to learn the landscape.
So let me start with a confession. I have not seen the film. However, I have talked to many people about it and read many criticisms and supports of it, and by all accounts, it's a very good and worthwhile movie. So I'm going to try this morning to give you a sort of a perspective on the whole picture that was going on, because it is really quite remarkable, and in many ways is a great testimony to the capability of this nation when it sets its mind to go about doing something that is extraordinarily difficult. So the recent film Oppenheimer greatly increased attention on nuclear bombs, the Manhattan Project, and the development of nuclear weapons. The film does an excellent job of presenting many of the aspects of the project that J. Robert Oppenheimer was directly involved in, and their subsequent consequences for him and the nation. While this is necessary for great drama, it can distort the reality of what was actually transpiring. This morning I'll try to give you a broader scientific and technical context to that story. With the onset of World War II and the estimated scientific capability of Germany, there was a real concern, particularly among many European scientists who had fled the United States, that Germany might develop nuclear weapons. Beginning in 1939, their warning and pleas that the U.S. Undertake the development of such a program did not gain much traction. However, with Pearl Harbor and the subsequent declaration of war on us by Germany, President Roosevelt, within a month, approved the development of an atom bomb. For the most part, the nation had no realization of what it had just committed itself to. However, with the appointment of General Leslie Groves in September of 1942 to head up that undertaking that became known as the Manhattan Project, it's a total misnomer because nothing happened in Manhattan. Things really began to move. It became clear during the development of the nuclear bomb that Nazi Germany could not have accomplished developing such a weapon. There were just far too many resources required that they didn't have. So I'm going to begin the story with a timeline. So it begins, strangely enough, on Christmas Eve of 1938, where Hahn and Meitner discovered that slow neutrons cause fission of the uranium isotope uranium-235. Just very soon after that, Fermi discovers that 2 neutrons are produced in every one of those fissions, and the possibility of a chain reaction is realized by most of the scientists. On the September of that year, Germany attacks Poland and World War II begins. On the 2nd of August, Einstein and Szilard wrote a letter urging President Roosevelt to investigate the development of developing nuclear weapons. Then, in early 1941, Glenn Seaborg, a professor at Berkeley, University of California, discovered plutonium, and he and Segre a month later showed that those slow neutrons can also cause the fission of the plutonium. On the 7th of December, I'm sure you all know, Pearl Harbor, war against Japan, and on the 11th of December, the United States declared war on Germany. And a month later, Roosevelt approves creation of the atomic bomb. General Groves starts the Manhattan Project on September 17th, 1942. 2 days after that, they go out and buy the land necessary to build the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. And Oak Ridge is assigned the job of enriching uranium so you can get at that U-235 isotope. Oppenheimer somehow he was a theoretical physicist at Berkeley at the time, and some of his colleagues got interested in bomb development, and Oppenheimer found himself, just by virtue of the culture that he was in, got himself involved, and he actually convened an important meeting with a bunch of the theoretical physicists in the United States, and he ended up suggesting to Groves that they set up a laboratory that ended up being Los Alamos, and Groves appointed it, approved it very soon. At the University of Chicago, Enrico Fermi built the first working reactor under Stagg Field on the university campus, a rather surprising development. They never told the president of the university that that's what they were doing. And later that month, the construction of Los Alamos begins, and Oppenheimer was appointed to be the director. That reactor that Fermi constructed within less than a month was able to show that it had become critical, and using that reactor, that plutonium-239 could be produced. And with that news, very quickly, the start of Hanford here in Washington began, with their assignment being to produce plutonium-239. D-Day happens in June of '44. The Hanford reactor reaches criticality in September of '44. In '45, and that reactor, by the way, is 1 million times the size of the thing that Fermi had created at Chicago. A scale up by a factor of 1 million is, to my mind, something unknown in science, and yet Fermi and Hanford pulled it off, and with some credit, I think, rightly going to DuPont. Roosevelt dies then in early '45. In May of that year, Roosevelt surrenders. Germany, excuse me. Germany surrendered. And the test firing of the first bomb at Alamogordo takes place. Truman issues a warning to Japan that a terrible thing is going to happen to them if they don't surrender. And of course, in August 6th and 9th, 2 bombs were dropped on Japan, and on the 11th of August, Japan surrendered. So what does nature provide you with to undertake this project? So what I'm shown here on this plot is a chart of all the nuclides. This is much more information than those people knew at that time, but they knew a goodly portion of it. So the last stable nucleus that exists is lead, the isotope of lead-208. There are 2 heavy isotopes of uranium that exist, and we'll talk about them. Uranium is much, much heavier than lead. Lead has 82 protons, uranium has 92, and it has 100, uranium-238 has 146 neutrons in it. So those are the nuclides, and those are the only two things that are out there that we can end up making use of. That's U-235 and U-238. So here now is a detail of looking at the nuclear chart. Here is uranium-235. It has a lifetime of 0.704 billion years. Uranium-238 has a lifetime of 4.47 billion years. The Earth has been around for about 5 billion years, so the amount of uranium-235 has been decaying away since the Earth was formed, and since the uranium was formed, it's been decaying away. And so by now, there's only 0.7% of the uranium that you find is uranium-235. 98.3%, 99.3% is U-238. And so separating out the U-235, the stuff that can fission from the U-238 is going to be a difficult task. With regard to making plutonium, what happens is if you have a neutron or a source of neutrons, and you can add one of them to U-238, that makes uranium-239, and it, in a couple of days, in a reactor, well, just a couple of days anywhere if you've made it, it decays to neptunium, and then over to plutonium-239. And so that's how you could make plutonium. If you could find a source of neutrons and bombard uranium-238 with it, you could end up manufacturing plutonium-239, and then you could separate the plutonium from uranium chemically. You can't chemically separate uranium-235 from uranium-238 because chemically they're exactly the same. So now let's take a look at what the physicists did know at that time in terms of the energy of what's happening. They knew that when you fission something as heavy as uranium and let's say break it in half, you end up releasing the order of something like 200 million 226 MeV. That's an amount of energy that's used for individual reactions. And the important things is that's 1,000,000 times greater than any chemical operation that you could make. The fact that the nucleus is so much smaller than an atom, it's about 5 orders of magnitude smaller, means it has to have much greater energy tied up in it because you need much greater forces to keep something bound together in a very small size. So there was that kind of energy available. They recognized it immediately. And then the question is, well, how should we think about it? Well, here is if you cause the fission of uranium, you could have it maybe in a small volume excite and cause 2 other nuclei to fission and arrange and get out. But the neutrons would likely escape and nothing else would happen. You would just have the release of a small amount of energy. In a critical mass, you have just the right amount of mass, or you're controlling it to the point that every time you create a fission, you actually have a neutron available to create another fission. So the reaction at that level is stable. You have it under control, and you're running in an equilibrium situation. In the supercritical mass, which is what you want for a bomb, you just want to throw a neutron into this stuff and have a massive chain reaction take place, instantaneous, using as many of the neutrons as you can to cause fission, and the amount of energy to be released would be typically 1,000,000 times more than you could get out of any similar chemical reaction at the time. And then the whole issue is, could you do it? So the known scientific and technical problems that you had to solve were, first of all, how would you make a bomb from a chain reaction? How much uranium or plutonium do you need? And how does the does the explosion from the chain reaction proceed? You can imagine that if it all went just super fast, you couldn't hold the thing together long enough for many reactions to take place. So you had to understand the timing of how all this thing went. Technically, the problems were simple and very well defined. First one was separating uranium-235 from 238, and then the production of plutonium in a reactor, and then chemically separating out the plutonium from all those radioactive things that allowed you to make it in the reactor. And of course, there were extraordinary administrative issues. First of all, finding the funds to do it, getting all the stuff you needed, organizing it. It's clear that what you were doing involved the government, the military, corporations, scientists, and a workforce. You wanted to maintain security and secrecy, and then somehow somebody's got to tie it all together. So it was even though it was called the Manhattan Project, 3 major sites were immediately selected. One was Oak Ridge, Tennessee. The other, Hanford Engineering Works out here in Washington, and Los Alamos in New Mexico. Those are the focal points, and these many other things ended up feeding into the project. It was astounding to me to learn that there were 600,000 people involved in the Manhattan Project in one way or another. So Oak Ridge. So it was clear that if it could be done, that making a nuclear weapon depended on producing sufficient amounts of those fissionable isotopes, uranium or plutonium. And how much was going to be needed to produce was uncertain. Anywhere, this is now the theoretical physicists at work with the little bit of information they had, and anywhere from about 10 to the order of 200 pounds. So a factor of 20 uncertainty. At any rate, obtaining any amount was going to be a serious and difficult task. We had been dragging our feet up to that point, but after Leslie Groves was put in charge of the project, he had the Corps of Engineers procure 35,000 acres of farmland in Tennessee to construct a temporary city and the facilities to develop the technology to separate uranium. So here's a little map. I don't know if you can see it. Here's Knoxville, and out here is Oak Ridge. It's about 30 miles from Knoxville, Tennessee. The Clinch River Valley in East Tennessee met the project's strategic demands. The valley was far enough inland that the enemy was not likely to attack it from the Atlantic or the Pacific. and yet close enough to a nearby workforce in Knoxville. It also had a lot of abundant electrical power, which you'll see they consume mightily, and clearing and cooling water from Clinch River. The first idea that was undertaken was to build a gaseous diffusion plant. You make something like uranium hexafluoride, and by a variety of diffusion processes are able finally to separate out the lighter U-235. But when they started designing what needed to be done, the building ended up being the biggest building in the world at that time. It was covered 44 acres, and it was too big to be constructed on a useful time scale to suit the needs of World War II. A few avenues of separation were pursued, but only electromagnetic separation using calutrons was able to meet the tight schedule requirements of the Manhattan Project. So, just to review again, uranium, which just has a half-life of 0.7 billion years, and uranium, which is has a half-life nearer the age of the Earth, 4.5 billion years, ends up having U-235, just about 0.7% of natural uranium. So they had to go about building a plant, and this is what a picture of the scale of what things had to be done at. And it required electricity. The district engineer of that Manhattan Project said that Oak Ridge itself consumed 1/7 of the electricity produced in the United States from 1943 to 1945. That's just enormous. So the electrical separation required building magnets that the U-235 would take a shorter path in the magnetic field than would the U-238, and if you had some catchers over there, you could start separating these two. It's serious and dirty work, and the difference in their masses was so small that it is very difficult to do it in any very clean and tidy fashion. It turned out that the magnetic fields were to be set up by passing currents through a coil, and the design originally called on using copper, but copper, it turned out, was not readily available because it was being used for shell casings. And so they had to use silver instead. And it turned out that I didn't realize this, we had a Fort Knox of silver up in West Point, New York. And these guys at Oak Ridge took 14,500 tons of silver to build those calutron coils. So that turned out to be, let's see, something like 29 million pounds. And after the war was over, everything except 11,000 pounds was returned. So somehow somebody skimmed off 11,000 pounds, which sounds tremendous, but on the scale of what was going on, it really wasn't that much. But that's just an incredible amount. They typically were dealing in selling silver in troy ounces. And when the project came in and said they wanted 14,000 tons, they were kind of overwhelmed. So the first shipments to Los Alamos of uranium enriched, and this was low enrichment to 13 or 15%, were made in March of '44. Well, it was no use of a bomb. It was required for people to start doing experiments with it enriched uranium. So on June 4th, June of '44, they made the first delivery of weapons-grade uranium, enriched to 89%. And by the end, they had enriched about 140 pounds of U-235, enriched to an average of about 80%, and that was the stuff that was used in the Hiroshima bomb. The Caluitron separation of uranium was abandoned, and for the present time, as many of you might know, centrifuging has improved to the point that it's the preferred moment of separation. If you recall, there's some rumor that the United States and Israel collaborated in fouling up the centrifuges in Iran some few years ago. So what they intended to build as a temporary town, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, now has a population of 31,000 people, and the lab employs 6,000 people, 2,000 of them scientists and engineers. Hanford, okay, the other part of the job. And to my mind, if there's any part of the story that can be attached to a single individual, it would be Enrico Fermi and the production of plutonium. He was an extraordinary physicist. He was at home as an experimentalist or a theoretician. He had won the Nobel Prize in 1938, and he actually used the trip to Stockholm to escape from fascist Italy with his Jewish wife, Flora. His initial direct contact with the project came in assembling the first working nuclear reactor using natural uranium and ultra-pure graphite at the University of Chicago. And it was referred to as CP1 for Chicago Pile 1. And Fermi said, and by using the word pile, he means pile. All they did was pile uranium and pure graphite into making a reactor. What he found is, and as you recall, that's the way if you can make a neutron, and it can be absorbed on uranium-238. You make uranium-238, decays to neptunium, and neptunium then decays to plutonium. So the question is, could you make a configuration where you had enough neutrons to keep the chain reaction going, and yet have one spare to capture on the uranium-238 to end up making the plutonium? That was not known, and there were several attempts to do it, and they failed. The idea of that actually made it work in the end was using ultra-pure graphite, so there was nothing there that absorbed the neutrons for other than use in causing further fissioning of 235 or producing uranium-239. Now, see, that reactor, that pile, was scaled up by a factor of 1,000,000 to become what was known as the B reactor at Hanford. The site for the production of plutonium was chosen to be Hanford, Washington. An ideal site was described by these 8 criteria: clean and abundant water, enough electricity. It was recognized it was going to be hazardous and dirty, so you wanted to be able to get a goodly thing. This is well over 100 square miles. The space for the laboratory would have to be 8 miles from the nearest reactor or separations plants. You didn't want people living upwind of this plant, which was apt to be spewing bad stuff. And there were supposed to be no towns of more than 1,000 people closer than 20 miles from that hazardous reptile. So you can see it was recognized that this was going to be pretty nasty business. Producing plutonium in the reactor was a feat, but the real dirty and difficult work lays ahead. The plutonium has to be chemically retrieved from the reactor's uranium fuel that has all the radioactive products that are in it from the reactor actually operating and fissioning U-235. And as shows this little map in the corner, here is the Hanford site right at the point where the river swings going south and then swings due west, is also joined up by the Snake and the Yakima rivers. A very interesting sort of area. So on January 26, 1943, the construction begins at Hanford. DuPont was engaged as the lead contractor to operate the complex. And to avoid being labeled as merchants of death, as had been the case after World War I, DuPont's executive committee insisted on receiving no payment. The government, however, was to assume all responsibility for the hazards involved in the project. So the construction of the reactor had to build the place up first. So the construction of the reactor didn't get underway till August of 43, and it was completed just about a year later in August of 44. You notice how close we're getting in time now to the end of the thing. It was a massive thing. This is a picture of it down here in the corner. It was roughly shown here 38 feet high by 28 feet wide by 39 feet long. An enormous thing. Fermi could think of no other way to make something that would be efficient enough to produce the plutonium that was needed. The cooling water was pumped through the tubes at the rate of 30,000 gallons a minute. The slugs were cylindrical, 1.5 inches in diameter and about 8 inches long. They were clad in aluminum so that the water flowing over them wouldn't come in direct contact with the uranium fuel. The reactor went critical in September, but after starting up, it mysteriously started shutting itself down. And then it would turn itself back on and shut itself down again. And finally, it was discovered that what was happening is one of the fission products, xenon 135, absorbs neutrons and actually was able to absorb neutrons at a big enough rate that it could turn the reactor off. And this xenon had a half-life of about 9 hours, so it would turn on, decay away, the reactor would come back on, and it was so it was a mess. There was no solution other than to just add more uranium to the pile and to just simply overwhelm the xenon absorption. Then it was discovered in Los Alamos that plutonium-240 undergoes spontaneous fission, which released neutrons that would figure a premature nuclear chain reaction. Let me show you just what that is. Whoop. So what happens is, remember I showed you this production here of, whoop, okay, so you have plutonium-239 now in the reactor, but in the reactor, you're letting this stuff sit in there to build up more of it, but it can absorb a neutron, and if it absorbs a neutron, it becomes plutonium-240, which you can't separate. So when you take the plutonium out, you get the 240 as well as the 239, and this stuff has a much shorter half-life and spontaneously fissions releasing neutrons. So if you were using, had this mixed in with the fuel, with the plutonium 239, you would have neutrons emitted, and as you tried to bring the pieces together to make a critical mass, the neutrons being released from this spontaneous fission would cause the fission reaction to take place before the pieces came together, and you'd have a dud. And so that was something that had to be overcome. It was overcome partly by bomb design and partly by not leaving the plutonium in the reactor for all that long. They ideally would have loved to have changed it sort of every 90 days, but they ended up having to change the fuel every 60 to 70 days. So you were handling the stuff even more than you wanted to. Excuse me for having to go through this. Okay, so now those irradiated natural uranium slugs were pushed out the back end of the reactor, as shown. So you put some more slugs in the reactor, and the radioactive ones drop out the back, fall down, go into a pool of water, and they're kept in that pool of water for about a week. They're still hotter than can be, but you have to start working on them at some point, so separation then begins. These first irradiated slugs were discharged from the reactor on Christmas Day, 1944. Separation got underway on the just completed plant for doing the separation. And boy, it is an eerie looking thing. This is a building, no windows. It was called the Queen Mary by the people who worked on the Hanford project. This is a look down the hall. It's 800 feet long, and everything is remotely handled. Things are so hot that you have to reduce the radioactive activity that you're dealing with by a factor of 10 million before you can do anything chemical to really seriously begin the separation. So those this plant that was involving this stuff discharged 1.5 million gallons of wastewater into the ground each day. And the work is you could recover about 0.5 pound of plutonium from each ton of radioactive uranium that you were dealing with. Hanford delivered its first small shipment of plutonium to Los Alamos on the 2nd of February, 1945, with more significant deliveries in May. By this time, Germany was no longer the target for the nuclear weapon, as it was clear they had not gotten very far and their surrender was imminent. Groves had promised General Marshall that a bomb would be ready by August 1, 1945. That was a very risky promise to have made at that time. The amount of plutonium shipped to Los Alamos grew rapidly during the spring and summer, and from April to May alone, the plutonium production increased by a factor of 5. June was even better, and by mid-August, 3 plutonium devices had been constructed at Los Alamos. Due to the isolation of the site, this is kind of an interesting thing. I don't go into it too long. They tried to pay really good wages to attract everyone. I thought one of the most interesting things was there was a very high turnover, and people were leaving the project because they thought they were not doing any work that was important to the war effort, which shows you how good the secrecy was. These people had no idea of what they were doing, Hanford then continued to produce plutonium in support of the nuclear weapons throughout the Cold War. Its production reactors were shut down in 1970, well, what ended up is, of course, they ended up making the most contaminated site in the Western world, and its cleanup is still going on with no clear end in sight. And I just mentioned the LIGO detector, which detects gravity waves, is out there, so you might want to visit it. And you can also see the B reactor if that happens to be to your taste. So at Los Alamos, there was scientists at the University of California were active in nuclear research. Lawrence had received the 1939 Nobel Prize for developing the cyclotron. Glenn Seaborg had discovered plutonium and participated in showing it was fissionable, and so it caught Oppenheimer's attention. Oppenheimer brought together a group of outstanding theorists to consider the feasibility and design of a nuclear bomb. The outcome of that meeting was that such a bomb could be produced. And this led the task of creating a bomb using fissionable material to be produced at other sites. Groves approved and surprisingly appointed Oppenheimer as director. I think it wasn't clear that Oppenheimer was the kind of guy that you would have thought would have headed a project like this. New Mexico was chosen as the site. It's isolated. Security was a very major concern, and Groves wanted to make all the Los Alamos workers members of the U.S. military. Oppenheimer had agreed with that, but there was just such a bad reaction to the scientists that they just objected to it. So the first idea for the bomb was really quite simple. It's just simply a cannon-like arrangement. So you have two pieces of subcritical uranium-235. You fire an explosive. It propels one into the other, and now you have a supercritical assembly, and you're ready to go. Off here is shown how it actually gets designed into a bomb. And what you had in addition to it is a thing, there it is, a plutonium-beryllium booster. So this is a thing that you make of plutonium, not plutonium, polonium and beryllium. And if you smash them together, there's a nuclear reaction that takes place that produces the neutrons. And that's really the trigger for this thing. So when this piece of uranium is fired down on top of this other piece, in addition, the polonium-beryllium starter is also actuated, and that triggers the bomb. And you know, it really was kind of tough to figure out just how much you ended up needing, and so for U-235 it was put at 115 pounds. The first bomb, called Little Boy, only had 108 pounds of 85 enriched uranium, and an additional 32 pounds of 50% enrichment. As I said, Oak Ridge barely made it. The gun type of bomb wouldn't work for doing the plutonium bomb because of the presence of plutonium-240 that would cause a dud if you try to explode it that way. So there was a very different arrangement designed where you tried to explosively and symmetrically crush a subcritical amount of plutonium-239 by about a factor of 2 or 3, so that it became supercritical and ignited, and you also at the same time caused a neutron burst to go into it. This is just a picture of its design. So here is the designing and assembling and testing the bomb. With Hanford in full production by 45, there would be ample plutonium. On the other hand, the uranium enrichment was slow and expensive, and there was only enough uranium on hand for one bomb. The design of a uranium bomb was simple and sure to work. It was decided to test one of the 2 plutonium weapons on hand. A bomb was identified and assigned the task of assembling the test. The test was to be carried out at the White Sands Proving Grounds in south central New Mexico. Here's Albuquerque, and down here, some 150 miles away or so, was the test site. Here's Alamogordo, the name that's often associated with it. And this is the Rio Grande River flowing down here. So the scientists were really uncertain as to what was going to happen. Projections ranged from a complete dud to an absolutely nutty idea that somehow it might ignite the atmosphere. Any one of the sensible people on the Manhattan Project knew that was impossible. One of the real adherents of that was Edward Teller. The nearest observers were 6 miles away, and the Army intelligence had mapped everyone within a 40-mile radius in case extensive evacuations were needed. So here was the bomb for the test. It was put in a steel construction, maybe 100 or so feet off the ground. And on July 16th, at 5:29 and 45 seconds, the bomb was triggered. This is a picture of what actually they saw, and this is what it looks like at a distance of 6 miles. I'll do it again. 6 miles is about the distance from here to West Seattle. So imagine that you were watching a detonation on West Seattle that looked like this. It's quite impressive. Ken Brainbridge, Harvard physicist in charge of the test, I think an amusing part of his job was that if the test should fail to go off, he would have to be the first person to approach the bomb and see what had gone wrong. As you might well imagine, as he said, I had a feeling of exhilaration that the gadget had gone off properly, followed by one of deep relief. I wouldn't have to go to the tower to see what had gone wrong. And for some reason, I can't understand, at 7 o'clock that morning, so an hour and a half after the bomb goes off, Enrico Fermi and Herb Anderson drive up to ground zero in a lead-lined tank and look around. They noticed a vast circular patch about a quarter mile in diameter of what came to be known as trinitite, a green glass-like substance created when the bomb melted the sand. Nothing was left of the tower. And of course the remaining problems had to do with fallout and secrecy. The bomb was supposed to go off at 4 o'clock in the morning, but weather conditions didn't allow it. So going off as it did at 5:30, many people saw that bright flash and wanted to know what was going on. So, here's a summary. The Manhattan Project, 600,000 people. It cost $2.2 billion in then dollars, and that's 40 billion in our own, in current dollars. Not all that expensive. So here's the way the money was spent. Oak Ridge ended up with a lion's share of it. They got the order of half. They got the order of almost half of it. Hanford was the next biggest spender. This is Los Alamos. So you can see, in a sense, Los Alamos was small peanuts in terms of the amount of money that was actually spent. It of course, received all of the attention because those glamour boys, those physicists, were getting all the attention. The special operating materials were buying uranium from the Belgians and the purified graphite. So you can see it was a massive undertaking. It represented an all-out commitment of our nation's resources. Its most remarkable characteristic to me was its organization and secrecy. That there were 600,000 people involved, and yet somehow we had no idea of what was going on. It was accorded the highest priority of any World War II development undertaking, and only the development of the B-29 was more costly. The development of the B-29 was 50% more expensive than this. And you can see that while Oppenheimer's contributions were great, they were necessarily a small piece of an enormous project. I think Oppenheimer may have been right in believing that the appalling destruction brought into existence by nuclear weapons would bring about the end of major wars. I'm afraid it's too early to tell. However, increasing the power of these World War II fission bombs by 1,000-fold with the creation of nuclear fusion bombs. Remember, these bombs, now you talk about megatons. This was kilotons. Hydrogen bombs, you talk about megatons. And it led to the concept of MAD, mutually assured destruction, and brought about the conclusion of the Cold War without armed conflict between ourselves and the Soviet Union. So these were the people who seemed to make the decision that the bomb would be dropped. Bush, Conan, Compton, the Navy Secretary, Ralph Baird, William Clayton, James Burns, George Marshall was also present, and Oppenheimer, Fermi, and Compton, and E.O. Lawrence were there, but just as scientific advisors. They had really no say in how the decision was made, other than to provide information. So the decision was made that dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was in the best interest of the United States, but not obviously an easy decision. A report that some of you may know of, the Frank report, they had received that report. There is a very, very interesting interview with Oppenheimer in 1965. You can get it on your computers by going to CBS News and just indicating Oppenheimer and 1965. It's a wonderful, wonderful interview. It tells you a great deal about the man and about what he was involved in. And I just want to add at the end, the development of nuclear weapons in the U.S. is in the hands of a civilian agency, the U.S. Department of Energy. With that, I'll conclude.
Okay.
Here we go.
I just found that film on YouTube, and I was watching it before I came down.
I'm sorry.
The film that you're talking about.
Oh, you bet, that interview with Oppenheimer.
Yeah, it's on-
Isn't it wonderful?
It's on YouTube. It's wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I should say it was brought to my attention by Barry Keane, and I'm grateful to him for it.
What stops the reaction and limits the size of the bomb? Do they run out of neutrons, or what controls the end of the reaction?
Okay, Don. For example, in the Hiroshima bomb, I said there was something like 130 pounds that were present in the bomb. Only 4 of them, 4 pounds, were actually detonated. All the rest of it just escaped unblown up. It just flies apart so fast that you can't convert it all. So it's, if you want to call it, an inherent inefficiency in the way you're using it.
Did they understand that inefficiency, or did they think maybe a much bigger bomb might be?
Oh, you bet. With Teller's motivation, they got into making fusion bombs. So you have mixtures of hydrogen and deuterium, and that stuff, as you might imagine, that is available in vast quantities. And so you have no trouble detonating 1,000 pounds of heavy water. And I think the biggest explosion that I know of is a Soviet explosion of 50 megatons.
When you were at Los Alamos, were there any people who had been left over from the original,
By the time I was in Los Alamos, I had no real contact with anyone who had been in the project. The contact I had with people who'd been in the project ended up being pretty close with Hans Beda, who I would meet when I would go out to Caltech, where he also visited in the summer. While I was at Princeton, Oppenheimer rarely came over to the physics department, and I never went to a seminar at the Institute, as they were all over my head.
I don't think so.
Okay. I was interested in your comment about the shipping of the plutonium from Hanford down to Los Alamos.
Yes.
How did they possibly do this with something as expensive and as needed to be done secretly?
I believe it was driven down in a car. I mean, the amounts that you had to deliver were not that big, right? I mean, the density of plutonium is sort of 19 grams per cc, so a 50-pound ball is certainly about no bigger than that. So it was by auto.
Why was Nagasaki and Hiroshima, why were those cities chosen?
Okay. That's a very interesting thing, and I'm sure that I don't really know the whole story. There was a list of 4 cities, and I think they were just simply unlucky. They they had not been, one of the rules was they had not been touched by any bombing earlier. And the one thing I do know is that the city of Kyoto, fortunately, was spared because Stimson, the Secretary of War, knew enough about Kyoto to recognize its cultural value, and so it was spared. But I really don't know why those two unfortunate cities were chosen.
Two questions. You mentioned something dropping out of the reactor. Was that pushed out, or did it just spontaneously drop?
No, just like I said, you pushed it in, it fell out the other end.
Okay. And then the second question, how did they drive it down in a car without getting fried?
It was a underground railroad, kind of an underground railroad kind of thing. So it was loaded into a cart, and that cart ran on the rails down to the T site. So all of it done remotely.
Okay, I thought you said automobile.
Oh no! The mobile was done after the separation, and you had the plutonium separated from all the radioactive products, and all Los Alamos had to do was figure out how to make it into metallic plutonium, and then make a bomb.
Can you tell us anything about the negotiations with the Belgians to get the uranium, and whether or not the Germans were leaning on the Belgians at that time?
No, I really don't know anything about that. I should know more, but I don't. Sorry.
I'm interested in something totally different. I think of having seen the movies after the blast,
Yes.
and the damage, the physical damage to people, and I'd like to know whether you have any information on any of the employees who were working in the United States or around Washington, even now with Hanford. What are the health problems?
Yeah, that I do. The project itself, the Manhattan Project, was remarkable in terms of how few employees actually were hurt. Now, but that project terminates before we go into the production of plutonium for the Cold War, because it was that production that led to the downwinders at the university, not at the Hanford site, and so most of that was post Manhattan Project. I think the Manhattan Project was incredibly fortunate that they had DuPont overseeing the production at Hanford. DuPont was involved in munitions, and so they knew how to take care of things and how to really do things in a very secure fashion. Apparently, while things were wonderful and secure and there were no direct health problems, the environmental mess that was created was just horrible.
So what do you know about that? I mean, about the damage to people. Did they end up having the same kinds of birth control, birth defects and so forth that was seen in Japan?
Not that I know of.
Can I address something?
Yeah, please do.
There have been very extensive studies of mortality among Hanford workers. They have no increased mortality. Part of that may be due to the fact of what's called the healthy worker effect, but extremely extensive studies. It's also, in the past, it was very argumentative, but the data seemed to support no effect on the workers. The question about the Hanford downwinders is another one. The Hutch did a very extensive study and basically found that they could not find any association with using really good scientific methods for thyroid disease with Hanford. I did a large study at Hanford of birth defects, found no association between either working at the plant or radiation exposed at the plant in terms of birth defects.
Thank you.
Boy.
Right. Let's see, there were 2 deaths at Los Alamos subsequent to the war. I don't know exactly all the details of them, but they were both having to do with instructional things where a man accidentally put 2 pieces of material and got it into a moderately critical force and realized what he was doing and shielded the people in the room by throwing his body on it.
I have a question. Is there any connection between
The downwinders, can you hear me? The downwinders from Hanford and the ones in Utah, southern Utah, especially as a result of Los Alamos. I've known people that are from South Utah, and they have told me about the downwinder effect and the high incident of cancer on the people around St. George, Utah.
I don't know anything about that, and I see he's got his hand up again.
If I remember right, the St. George was not Los Alamos. There were testing areas in South Utah. A number of sheep died, and people subsequently attributed cancers to the site. But that's separate from Los Alamos and certainly from Hanford. If I'm remembering right, this is 40 years ago.
Was that mining?
No, that's a whole different story. Uranium mining is a whole different story. This was a test. These were test sites. The big problems with uranium mining was in New Mexico and predominantly a large number of Navajos, and there the exposure is to radon daughters, decay products.
Yeah, I didn't know there was testing in Utah. Could you give him the mic back?
Well, as I understand it, there was testing in Utah, or else it could have been from the Nevada test site going into Utah. I don't remember the geography.
Yeah, I thought all the testing was in Nevada.
It was testing. Another one, just to talk about some of the other issues. Most people don't know this, but the AEC set off an underground nuclear blast in a place called Tatum Dome in the piney woods of Mississippi. They wanted to see whether they could detect underground tests, so they decided, well, this is a nice little town in Mississippi. They're what are called salt domes that are clear, and the AEC, in fact, set off a nuclear device there. It was very small, but the community was not happy about it subsequently.
May I say something about?
Of course.
There is a beautiful photo reportage by Carol Gallagher called American Ground Zero, which has pictures and stories of people in the New Mexico area who suffered from the test explosions. If you are interested, I own the book.
I just have a question about the number 600,000 people involved. The population of the United States at that time wasn't anywhere near that much. Where were all these people?
Oh, I think the population of the United States.
I'm sorry. I'm thinking of million. Excuse me.
Okay, thank you.
It's still a pretty big town, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, all right.
Nowadays, we have nuclear power plants all over the world. We've been able to slow these reactions down and control them somehow so that they're not bombs. So how is that done?
Oh, okay. Don, you notice there was this stage where things were called critical, and so you just by being able to put in and out things that absorb neutrons, you can get the pile to keep running but not be out of control. So you get it at equilibrium, producing a certain amount of energy, and by virtue of those control rods can keep the reactor from running away. Yeah. And I might say, I mean, today a power reactor is not much bigger than a cubic meter. It's just 3 by 3 by 3.
If I could make a comment about the social history of the Hanford site.
Yeah.
People were thrown off their farms. The government took over. It was a fantastic project to develop housing and so on. You mentioned people leaving Hanford. A lot of them left because of what were called the termination winds. If you've ever been in the Tri-Cities, even now, the winds blow. And in those days, the winds were worse because there weren't the buildings. And they call them termination winds because after a big wind, people would pick up their check and leave. My maternal grandfather was one of the original settlers in the town of Hanford in 1906. He and his brother came out from Kansas. His brother's wife, after 1 year, says, "These winds are making me crazy, I'm going back to Kansas." And they left.
I'm confused about terminology. I thought that the bomb to end all bombs is called the fusion bomb. It destroys everything that lives but doesn't affect inanimate objects. Can you tell us something about the evolution of the most horrible bombs that we now have access to? The neutron bomb?
Well, I've heard talk of a neutron bomb. People, what can you say? The one thing you might like about it is that it wouldn't destroy all the buildings.
Yes.
I don't know how radioactive it would leave them, but
So who cares?
but I don't know of any serious person who talks about neutron bombs.
Next one is Al. Here you go.
I'm just curious about the scale of reactors. They're putting them now on submarines and other vessels. Do you have any idea how large those are?
No, I don't. No, I don't. I mean, they drive battleships, not battleships, aircraft carriers now are nuclear propulsion, and so yeah, I don't know about the power requirements, but yeah, you can imagine that it's so much better than it was because you can get so much more out of a small amount of fuel compared to what you could if you were depending on some non-nuclear process to give you the energy.
Jerry, I remain very puzzled about the sociological aspect of this. I can't imagine, and you probably know, I mean, it's just a lack of my imagination, how such an enormous project, whose final conclusion could not be certain, was started. Who was so convincing to the authorities of this nation that allowed for that much of an investment in something yet to be proved?
You want to know why such a large investment was made?
Yeah, who convinced, who was the salesman who sold the Roosevelt administration to undertake such a huge investment?
Yeah.
whose outcome could not be assured.
Yeah, and a huge investment in a sense that you don't know what the outcome is going to be. Yeah. Well, initially I think it was fear, which is a powerful motivator. Fear that Germany would come up with the weapon first. And it certainly is correct that if they were able to realize such a weapon, it would have had a very material effect on the outcome of the war. I think there's little doubt of that. What wasn't realized was just how hard the job was and what amount of resource was required to actually accomplish it. And Germany, by the time, even if they were left alone, I think couldn't have done it. But they were under such stress from just continued bombing and things that they just never had a chance, to my mind. If that's an answer to your question.
No, not really.
Adolf Hitler.
We would have it too, but we didn't know what was going to happen. And some scientists, I presume, were able to convince them to invest that kind of money.
Oh, I think that's true. I think after the meeting that Oppenheimer had, and you had really the most outstanding scientists in the world, people like Niels Bohr was certainly very active in convincing it. Szilard played a very big role. But I can't find, or I don't believe, that there is any single individual that you can assign the requirements to. It turned out that, as you might imagine, people even like Groves was scientifically really quite naive. He really believed it was possible that the bomb could set off the atmosphere. And you know, if you had, to my mind, any real sense at all about how things worked, you would have known that couldn't happen.
If I could make one comment direct to that, there's a very interesting book called The Apocalypse Factory that goes into all of the history of the decision making, not the physics, but the processes, and I recommend it very highly. That'll answer Lester's question. The Apocalypse Factory. And it's focused on Hanford. Factory. Apocalypse, like the end of the world, factory.
Eric?
One reason Germany did not get the bomb is a lot of the nuclear scientists in Europe were Jewish.
Yes.
And they're getting out of Europe as fast as they could.
You bet.
And another reason, on a military viewpoint, Hitler was spectacularly successful in the early phases of the war using conventional weapons. So there didn't seem to be, at that time, any reason to get a mega weapon.
Yeah. I might add, in following up on Lowell's comment, there's a fascinating book that is the recorded conversations of German scientists who were members of what was called Hitler's Uranium Club. So it was the German scientists involved in the bomb. After the war, the Allies captured a fair number of them and put them up in a rather nice lodgings in England, in a nice big farmhouse. And the Germans believed that the English were such gentlemen that they wouldn't bug the place. But of course, while they are very gentlemanly, they still thought it was a great opportunity. And you can learn a great deal about what the problems were that the Germans had in making a bomb. When they had they were imprisoned in this thing in May of 1945, and when they heard about the bomb going off in August, they thought it was just a lie. It was just a propaganda thing that the Allies had pushed. And they just didn't think it was possible. No?
Yeah, and no, I was just going to say that Heisenberg in particular
Yes.
said, oh
Yeah.
no, this can't be.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm glad. I guess that this might have been interesting to you.